Honshu, Japan, March 10, 1945. Just after 0030 hours, the lead B-29 Superfortress, Dauntless Dottie, began its descent towards the designated release point over Tokyo. The mission brief had been clear, almost reassuring. A low-altitude incendiary raid, targeting the densely packed wooden structures of the Japanese capital, with intelligence estimates predicting only light and scattered anti-aircraft fire. The aircrews, many veterans of earlier, higher-altitude precision bombing runs against industrial targets, braced themselves for what they believed would be a comparatively straightforward operation, a calculated risk with a high probability of success against a city deemed vulnerable. Captain Edward J. Miller, pilot of the B-29 City of Peoria, maintained his altitude at 5,000 feet, his eyes scanning the moonlit horizon for the familiar glint of searchlights or the telltale puffs of flak. His pre-flight briefing had emphasized the element of surprise and the supposed limitations of Japanese night defenses, especially at this uncharacteristically low altitude for superfortresses. The expectation was that the Japanese would be caught off guard, their heavy anti-aircraft batteries, designed for high-altitude interception, largely ineffective against the fast, low-flying bombers. The B-29, a marvel of wartime engineering, represented the pinnacle of American strategic bombing capability. Its four Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines, each generating 2,200 horsepower, propelled the massive airframe with its 141-foot wingspan at speeds exceeding 350 miles per hour. Its pressurized cabins allowed for high-altitude operations, but for this mission, the crews were breathing unpressurized air, a concession to the tactical decision to drop incendiaries from a lower ceiling for maximum effect. Each bomber carried approximately 12,000 pounds of E-46 incendiary clusters, each cluster containing 38 individual M69 napalm-filled bombs, designed to spread molten fire across a wide area. Production logs from the Boeing Wichita plant indicated that by early 1945, output had reached an impressive 200 B-29s per month, a testament to the industrial might marshaled for the Pacific Theater. This unprecedented scale of production fueled the strategic planners' confidence in overwhelming Japanese defenses through sheer numbers and sustained pressure. The strategic implication of such a raid, if successful, was to cripple Japanese war production by destroying its cottage industries and to demoralize the civilian population, hastening an end to the protracted conflict. The ideological underpinning was that a decisive blow could be delivered from the air, minimizing the need for a costly ground invasion. The night air over Tokyo, initially calm and deceptively clear, offered little to contradict the optimistic projections. The faint glow of the distant city, still largely unmolested by the approaching armada, seemed to promise a night of routine destruction, a surgical strike against a sleeping giant. The rhythm of the engines, the hum of the intercom, and the quiet commands from the cockpit filled the cabin, a familiar symphony of impending action. The descent began with a gradual, almost imperceptible tilt, the B-29s shedding altitude with the deliberate grace of immense birds of prey. This was not the typical high-altitude ingress that had defined American strategic bombing for years, the realm where oxygen masks were mandatory and flak bursts blossomed far below like harmless distant chrysanthemums. Instead, the superfortresses were dropping, steadily, inexorably, towards a stratum of air where the world would suddenly become terrifyingly immediate. The standard operating procedure for B-29 operations over Japan had been to bomb from altitudes between 28,000 and 32,000 feet, a height that minimized exposure to all but the heaviest, radar-directed anti-aircraft fire and offered a degree of protection from interceptors. This new directive, however, called for runs as low as 5,000 to 8,000 feet, a radical departure born from the consistent failure of precision bombing at higher altitudes due to strong jet stream winds and the inherent limitations of the Norden bombsight against widespread urban targets. The decision to gamble on low-level incendiary attacks, spearheaded by General Curtis LeMay, was a calculated risk, trading the relative safety of height for the devastating accuracy of proximity. Each aircraft, a marvel of wartime engineering, was designed for high-altitude performance. Its pressurized cabin and powerful turbo-supercharged engines optimized for operations in the thin air of the stratosphere. The B-29's maximum speed at altitude could reach 357 miles per hour, and its service ceiling was an impressive 31,850 feet. Descending to these lower strata, the aircraft became more vulnerable, its large airframe a more inviting target, its speed less of an advantage against ground defenses. The unpressurized bomb bay doors, designed for high-altitude release, would now open into a denser, more turbulent air, potentially affecting the precise trajectory of the incendiary clusters. The weight of the incendiary payload further complicated the descent. A typical B-29 could carry up to 20,000 pounds of bombs on shorter missions, and for these firebombing raids, the bomb bays were crammed with M69 incendiary clusters, each containing 38 individual gelled gasoline bomblets. The total weight of the incendiary load, often exceeding 12,000 pounds per aircraft, meant that even at lower altitudes, the aircraft remained a heavy, momentum-laden projectile, requiring careful management of speed and angle during the approach to the target. The internal bomb racks, designed to hold general-purpose bombs, were adapted with specialized clips to secure the incendiary clusters, ensuring their stable release. The strategic implication of this unprecedented low-level approach was a direct assault on the Japanese industrial heartland, which was largely decentralized and intertwined with residential areas. High-altitude precision bombing had proven ineffective against this dispersed manufacturing model. The tactical shift aimed to ignite widespread conflagrations, creating firestorms that would not only destroy industrial capacity, but also demoralize the civilian population and cripple the war effort. The gamble was that the psychological impact of such a devastating attack, coupled with the material destruction, would hasten surrender, outweighing the increased risk to aircrews. As the Superfortresses continued their descent, the distinctive hum of their four Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines grew louder, a deep thrum that resonated through the airframe. The pilots, their faces illuminated by the dim glow of instrument panels, adjusted trim and power settings, guiding their immense machines lower and lower towards an expected light flak environment. Tokyo, March 10, 1945. The lead B-29s, part of the 314th Bombardment Wing, began their descent, leveling off at 5,000 feet, a dangerously low altitude for such a large aircraft in a contested airspace. Their bomb bays, instead of the high-explosive ordnance typically reserved for industrial targets, were filled with a different kind of payload, one designed not to shatter, but to ignite. This strategic shift, born from the frustration of prior high-altitude precision bombing failures against dispersed Japanese industry, marked a desperate escalation in the air campaign. Betting on the vulnerability of Japan's urban fabric, the first sticks of M69 incendiary clusters tumbled from the bomb bays, their fins deploying to stabilize their descent. Each cluster, a cylindrical casing approximately 30 inches long and 8 inches in diameter, contained 38 individual hexagonal bomblets, each weighing about 6 pounds. These bomblets, upon impact, ejected a small charge of white phosphorus to scatter their primary incendiary agent, napalm, a gelatinous mixture of gasoline and thickener. The M69's design was a product of extensive testing at Dugway Proving Ground, where mock-ups of Japanese residential structures, constructed from authentic materials, had been subjected to various incendiary weapon types, demonstrating the M69's superior ability to penetrate and spread fire within lightweight wooden construction. Production logs from the various ordnance plants, including the Rocky Mountain Arsenal and the Sunflower Ordnance Works, indicated a daily output of M69s reaching into the tens of thousands by late 1944, a ramp-up directly proportional to the strategic shift towards incendiary warfare. Over 10,000 tons of these munitions were allocated for the initial phases of the firebombing campaign against Japan, a scale of incendiary deployment unprecedented in aerial warfare. This massive logistical undertaking underscored the American High Command's belief that the destruction of Japan's urban infrastructure, which housed both its workforce and significant cottage industries, was key to breaking its will to fight. As the first M69s struck the densely packed residential and commercial districts of Tokyo, their impact was immediate and devastating. The thin corrugated iron and tile roofs offered little resistance to the bomblets, which often penetrated into the wooden structures below before detonating. The napalm, upon ignition, adhered to surfaces, burning intensely at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius, rapidly overwhelming the flimsily constructed homes and shops. Damage reports from subsequent reconnaissance flights and post-war analyses confirmed that the initial fires, rather than remaining isolated, quickly coalesced into larger conflagrations, driven by the close proximity of buildings and the prevailing winds. The psychological impact on the ground was profound, as documented in survivor accounts and post-war interrogations of captured Japanese personnel. The sudden eruption of multiple simultaneous fires across wide areas created a sense of overwhelming chaos and terror, far exceeding the localized destruction of conventional high-explosive bombing. The sheer number of ignition points, estimated by initial assessments to be in the hundreds per square mile within the target zones, rendered traditional firefighting methods utterly ineffective. It was a calculated strategy designed to overwhelm the urban fire defense system, a system already strained by years of war and resource scarcity. The firestorm began its relentless expansion, consuming everything in its path. The individual blazes, initially distinct pockets of destruction, began to merge with terrifying speed. The intense heat generated by hundreds of burning structures created powerful updrafts, drawing in cooler air from the surrounding streets and fueling the inferno. This convection intensified the winds, which, already significant at 20 to 30 miles per hour, now accelerated to gale force, transforming localized fires into a unified, raging front. The urban landscape, tightly packed with wooden houses and workshops, became a colossal tinderbox. Narrow alleys and closely built structures acted as natural conduits, channeling the superheated air and flames with devastating efficiency. Fire breaks, where they existed, proved woefully inadequate against the sheer scale and ferocity of the advancing conflagration, their intended purpose overwhelmed by the radiant heat and flying embers. Within minutes, the conflagration reached critical mass, transitioning into a firestorm. This phenomenon, distinct from a mere large fire, is characterized by a self-sustaining vortex of superheated gases and hurricane-force winds. The air temperature at the center of such a storm can exceed 1,000 degrees Celsius, incinerating everything combustible and even melting glass and metal. Eyewitness accounts, collected in post-raid civilian interviews, consistently describe a sky turned blood red and a ground that vibrated with the roar of the consuming flames. The sheer volume of oxygen consumed by the firestorm created an almost vacuum-like effect at its periphery, making respiration impossible for those trapped within its grasp. Survival became a matter of immediate escape from the advancing perimeter, not of fighting the fire itself. The firestorm's destructive power was not limited to direct incineration. The extreme heat caused materials to spontaneously combust, igniting buildings hundreds of yards ahead of the main fire front. This preheating effect accelerated the conflagration's spread, ensuring that new fuel was continuously prepared for consumption, creating an unstoppable wave of destruction across the urban fabric. The structural integrity of buildings, even those not directly engulfed in flames, was compromised by the intense radiant heat. Steel girders warped and twisted, concrete cracked and spalled, leading to widespread structural collapse that further fueled the fire by exposing fresh combustible materials. The city was not merely burning, it was being systematically dismantled by the thermal energy unleashed upon it. The cumulative effect of these merging fires and accelerating winds was a landscape utterly transformed within a few hours. Where streets and buildings had stood, there was now a churning vortex of flame and smoke, a literal pillar of fire that rose thousands of feet into the night sky, casting an apocalyptic glow for miles around. The initial precision targeting had yielded to an indiscriminate elemental force. Hamburg, July 28, 1943. The air above the city, once a canvas of searchlight beams and tracer fire, began to transform into a roiling, incandescent maelstrom. Below, the nascent firestorm, ignited by the concentrated incendiary drops, started its inexorable climb, drawing the very atmosphere into its destructive embrace. Pilots in the later waves, expecting the predictable patterns of anti-aircraft fire, instead reported a terrifying spectacle of superheated air and smoke that defied all prior combat experience. The initial, widespread conflagrations, fueled by the dense packing of timber-framed buildings and the dry summer conditions, coalesced rapidly. An observation from a returning B-29 crew described the city as a single immense furnace, a perception confirmed by subsequent aerial reconnaissance photographs depicting an unbroken expanse of incandescent ruin. The individual fires, no longer isolated events, merged to create a unified thermal column, a chimney of unimaginable scale that began to dictate its own meteorology. This colossal column of superheated air, rising with immense velocity, created a profound pressure differential at its base. Cold air from the surrounding areas rushed inward to fill the void, generating winds that quickly escalated to hurricane force. Damage reports from the periphery of the affected zone documented structural failures consistent with wind speeds exceeding 150 miles per hour, tearing roofs from buildings and overturning vehicles not directly consumed by flame. The sheer scale of the oxygen consumption within the firestorm was unprecedented. As the inferno roared, it devoured atmospheric oxygen at a rate that suffocated any life not immediately incinerated. Interrogation files from survivors recounted a desperate struggle for breath, even in areas not yet reached by direct flame, as the air became thin and acrid, filled with carbon monoxide and superheated particulate matter. The effect was akin to a vast open-air vacuum, drawing in all available breathable air. The phenomenon was not merely a large fire, it was a self-sustaining system of destruction, a feedback loop where heat generated more wind, and more wind fed more oxygen to the flames, intensifying the heat. The thermal energy released was estimated by post-war analyses to be equivalent to several thousand conventional bombs detonating simultaneously, but distributed over an area of several square miles. The upward convection currents were so powerful that they carried debris, ash, and even human remains thousands of feet into the atmosphere, painting the sky with the city's demise. The pilots, flying at altitudes where they typically encountered only the distant detached bursts of flak, now found themselves grappling with an entirely new and unforeseen aerial hazard. The intense heat radiated upwards, causing turbulence and buffeting that jarred the heavy bombers even at 20,000 feet. The rising smoke plume, a dark and ominous column, reached heights of over 30,000 feet, casting a pall that stretched for hundreds of miles and turning the daylight sky into an unnatural twilight. The sheer volume of superheated gases and particulate matter ejected from the firestorm, created a unique atmospheric phenomenon. The air itself became a medium of destruction, not just through heat and wind, but through the toxic cocktail of combustion products. The light from the inferno below, refracted and reflected by the dense smoke and ash, painted the undersides of the clouds a horrifying, flickering orange, a celestial echo of the devastation beneath. The firestorm, in its terrifying efficiency, left little for subsequent bombing waves to destroy, a testament to its indiscriminate power. The urban fabric, once a complex tapestry of streets and buildings, was reduced to a homogeneous plain of smoldering rubble, its contours erased by the all-consuming heat and wind. The sky, once a domain of strategic air power, had become an active participant in the destruction, a conduit for the inferno's reach. The first fingers of dawn, pale and hesitant, began to trace the outlines of the shattered city. What had been a vibrant urban tapestry hours before was now a landscape of pulverized stone and twisted metal, a stark testament to the night's inferno. The fires, though largely contained, still smoldered in 1,000 places, sending up thin, acrid plumes that stained the nascent sky. Streets were choked with rubble, impassable canyons where buildings had once stood shoulder to shoulder. The intricate network of tram lines, once the city's circulatory system, lay ripped from its foundations, rails contorted into grotesque sculptures. Utility poles, stripped of their wires, leaned at impossible angles, silent sentinels over the devastation. Damage assessments, compiled by weary municipal engineers in the hours that followed, painted a grim picture. An estimated 85% of residential structures within the historic core were either completely destroyed or rendered uninhabitable. Public records indicated a pre-raid population of 180,000 people within the affected districts. Initial casualty estimates, derived from overwhelmed hospital admissions and the grim work of recovery teams, suggested figures approaching 40,000 dead, with tens of thousands more injured. The sheer scale of the destruction overwhelmed existing emergency services. Fire brigades, their equipment damaged and their ranks depleted, fought a losing battle against the widespread conflagrations. Medical personnel, operating in makeshift aid stations, struggled to triage the endless stream of wounded, their supplies dwindling rapidly. The infrastructure of daily life had simply ceased to exist. Survivors, emerging from cellars and shelters, moved through the ruins in a daze, their faces streaked with ash and disbelief. The air was thick with the scent of smoke, dust, and something else, a cloying, metallic odor that spoke of burnt flesh and pulverized bone. The silence, broken only by distant crackling and the occasional wail, was more profound than any noise. The strategic implications of such widespread urban destruction were immediately apparent to the occupying forces. While the industrial targets had been largely spared, the obliteration of the city's social fabric presented an entirely new set of challenges. Resistance movements, previously operating in the shadows, found fertile ground in the chaos and despair, their ranks swelling with those who had lost everything. The psychological impact on the populace was immeasurable. A generation would bear the scars of that night, their collective memory etched with images of the sky turned to fire. The easy certainties of civilian life had been irrevocably shattered, replaced by a pervasive sense of vulnerability and loss. The world had irrevocably shifted on its axis. Air Staff intelligence reports, compiled in the immediate aftermath, began to coalesce into a grim accounting. The initial operational assessment, based on returning crews debriefings and preliminary photographic reconnaissance, had drastically underestimated the true extent of the losses. What had been anticipated as a manageable engagement, perhaps a dozen aircraft lost to conventional flak, transformed into a catastrophe that would reverberate through the strategic bombing command. Damage assessment teams, scrutinizing aerial photographs taken days later, identified 59 distinct wreck sites scattered across the target area and along the return routes. Each mangled airframe represented a crew of 10, a total of 590 airmen, a figure that dwarfed any previous single-mission loss for the 8th Air Force. The sheer volume of destruction suggested a new, terrifying efficacy in German aerial defense, far beyond the capabilities predicted by pre-mission intelligence. Analysis of the recovered wreckage, where possible, revealed a consistent pattern of high explosive fragmentation and catastrophic structural failure, typical of direct flak hits. However, the density of these hits, often concentrated in critical areas like engine nacelles and wing roots, indicated an unprecedented accuracy and volume of fire. German flak units, traditionally considered effective but not overwhelming, had seemingly achieved a state of hyper-efficiency. Interrogation files from captured German anti-aircraft personnel, later compiled by Allied intelligence, began to shed light on this anomaly. These documents indicated that a significant portion of the flak batteries protecting the target had been recently upgraded with new radar-guided fire control systems, specifically the Würzburg Risa, which offered significantly enhanced precision over older optical or acoustic methods. Production logs from German armaments factories corroborated an accelerated deployment of these advanced systems in the preceding months. The strategic implications were immediate and profound. The notion of daylight precision bombing, already a contentious doctrine, faced its gravest challenge: the loss of nearly 60 heavy bombers in a single raid, representing a combat attrition rate of over 15% for the attacking force, was unsustainable. This single mission forced a fundamental reevaluation of bomber escort requirements and the viability of unescorted, deep penetrations into heavily defended airspace. The psychological impact on aircrews was equally devastating. The expected light flak had become a wall of fire, and the perceived vulnerability of the unbreakable flying fortress had been shattered. Crew morale reports from subsequent missions documented a marked increase in anxiety and a palpable dread of similar encounters, transforming routine operations into journeys fraught with existential terror. The cost of the mission, measured in both material and human spirit, would linger long after the smoke cleared. Tokyo, March 10, 1945. The B-29 Superfortresses, stripped of defensive armament and loaded exclusively with incendiary clusters, descended to altitudes between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, a stark departure from the high-altitude precision bombing doctrine that had characterized earlier campaigns. This tactical shift, born of frustration with persistent jet stream winds and the limited effectiveness of general-purpose bombs against dispersed Japanese industry, aimed to exploit the highly combustible nature of Tokyo's urban landscape. The decision to fly at lower altitudes, foregoing the protection of heavy machine guns, was predicated on intelligence reports suggesting a weak and disorganized Japanese air defense, a fatal miscalculation that would soon become terrifyingly clear. The first waves of aircraft, operating in the pre-dawn darkness, encountered scattered anti-aircraft fire, a volume consistent with pre-mission briefings that had promised light flak. Pilots reported sporadic bursts, easily evaded as they released their payloads of M69 incendiaries, each canister containing 38 hexagonal gelled gasoline bomblets designed to scatter and ignite over a wide area. These initial fires, though significant, did not immediately convey the scale of the impending catastrophe, merely serving as beacons for subsequent waves of B-29s. The strategy relied on creating a conflagration, a self-sustaining firestorm that would consume everything in its path, rather than targeting specific industrial complexes. As the raid progressed, the sky over Tokyo began to glow with an intensity that defied the imagination, reflecting off the underbellies of the incoming bombers. The initial, Manageable fires coalesced into vast infernos, driven by powerful winds generated by the heat. Damage reports from later reconnaissance flights confirmed that temperatures at the core of the firestorm reached an estimated 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, sufficient to melt glass and warp steel girders. The urban fabric, predominantly constructed from wood and paper, offered little resistance, transforming entire districts into a churning sea of flame. The Japanese air defense, initially underestimated, rallied with unexpected ferocity as the fires intensified. While the early B-29s had faced only light resistance, subsequent waves were met with a rapidly escalating barrage of anti-aircraft fire, now guided by the towering columns of smoke and flame. Fighter aircraft, previously held in reserve or struggling with maintenance issues, were scrambled in greater numbers, their pilots driven by the visible destruction of their capital. The low altitude of the American bombers, intended to improve accuracy, now made them vulnerable targets for both ground batteries and interceptors. The tactical shift from high-altitude precision to low-altitude area incendiary bombing represented a profound re-evaluation of strategic air power's role in the Pacific theater. Earlier bombing efforts, focused on individual factories or infrastructure, had yielded disappointing results against a resilient and decentralized Japanese war economy. The adoption of incendiary tactics, perfected in European campaigns against German cities, was an acknowledgement that the complete destruction of urban areas and, by extension, civilian morale, was now considered a viable and necessary objective. This marked a departure from the earlier, often stated aim of avoiding civilian casualties. The human cost of this new strategy was immediate and devastating. Japanese government reports, compiled in the weeks following the raid, estimated 83,793 fatalities and 40,918 injured, though many historians now place the death toll significantly higher, potentially exceeding 100,000. These figures, derived from municipal records and hospital admissions, represent a single night's casualties exceeding those of many conventional ground battles. The sheer speed and intensity of the firestorm meant that many victims were wrapped in their homes or on the streets, succumbing to heat stroke, carbon monoxide poisoning, or outright incineration. The material destruction was equally staggering. Reconnaissance photographs, meticulously analyzed by intelligence units, revealed that 15.8 square miles of Tokyo, approximately 25% of the city's total area, had been completely razed. Production logs from the Japanese Ministry of Munitions indicated a temporary but significant disruption to war material output, particularly in small-scale, dispersed workshops that had been integrated into residential areas. The psychological impact on the surviving populace, documented in post-war interviews, was profound. A collective trauma that underscored the vulnerability of even the largest metropolis to sustained aerial assault. The Tokyo raid, code-named Operation Meeting House, became a grim benchmark for urban destruction, surpassing in immediate lethality any single air raid conducted up to that point in history. It demonstrated the devastating potential of concentrated incendiary attacks against cities built with flammable materials, particularly when coupled with favorable meteorological conditions. The strategic implications were clear. Air power, when applied with such overwhelming force and focused on the destruction of entire urban centers, could inflict catastrophic damage on an enemy's industrial capacity and societal fabric, regardless of the precision of individual bomb drops. The lessons learned from Tokyo profoundly influenced subsequent bombing campaigns against other Japanese cities, leading to a systematic application of incendiary tactics across the archipelago. The precedent established that night shifted the paradigm of strategic bombing from targeting specific military assets to the wholesale destruction of urban environments. Production data from the Boeing factory in Wichita, Kansas, recorded an increase in B-29 output to 300 aircraft per month